Hello, my name's Colin Osborne from the University of Sheffield, and in my talk I want to explore the idea that competition could have acted as an ecological selection pressure during domestication. First, I want to acknowledge my co-authors in this work, particularly Yishang Shan and Alicia Gomez-Fernandez, who did the experimental work, Rob Freckleton, who collaborated on the competition aspects, Glynis Jones on the archaeology, Ruben Mia on the ecology, and Joachim Evers on the modelling work. The central question that we're interested in addressing is, how did domestication occur? And our hypothesis in this is that domestication arose from a process of unintentional selection. So that worked through human interactions with plants rather than as a direct outcome of an intentional outcome of directed breeding. So what we think in our hypothesis is going on is that people deliberately planted plants and interacted with plants, but then ecology took over and selected for particular traits rather than people deliberately seeking those traits in directed breeding programs. So the way we think this might have worked is that while plants grow in an unmodified natural soil, then people intentionally manipulated those food plants and their environments. So they tilled soils, they sowed plants into the soils, they amended soils with manure, they added water potentially, and then as an unintentional consequence of that, ecology took over, selected on the plant traits within those environments and adapted the plants to those new anthropogenic environments. And the idea I want to test today in this talk is the idea that competition among crop genotypes and between crops and their weeds might have selected for stronger competitive ability in the vegetative phase. The first experiment that I want to show you is one that Yishang Shan did, and he made a comparison between domesticated landraces and their wild relatives in three wheat domestication events. So the domesticated and wild forms of Timor-Thieves wheat, einkorn wheat and emmer wheat. And he took an approach of growing focal plants in a density gradient of the other species. So the scheme of the experiment is laid out here. So there's one wild focal plant here on this row on the top, and a density gradient from 0 to 21 domesticated forms, and then the opposite design on the bottom here. He replicated that for each domestication event. Then he looked at the impact of competition on the focal plants. So here are the focal plants after competition. You can see the effect of the density gradient on them. So he removed the competitors, leaving those plants. He harvested those plants, and then he normalized their dry weight by the weight without competition. So that's this weight on the left-hand side here. And then that allows us to look at the reaction to competition whilst accounting for size. And then he calculated, and I'll show the response ratio as the log of domesticated over wild as log D minus log W. And what this shows is that the landraces are stronger competitors than their wild relatives as the density increases. So the difference between these normalized weights of the focal plants increases as density increases. So this is that response ratio, this is the neighbour density in that density gradient. And that's true for all three domestication events. So we were interested in figuring out which plant traits are responsible for that stronger competitive ability in the domesticated landraces. And so we used a functional structural plant model which simulates cereal growth, tillering and flowering. So these are just cartoons that it produces, but of course all the model action occurs in the back end in silico. And the model simulates canopy carbon fixation, but it also does crop growth and development. And we parameterized it for each wheat species using data from a previous experiment that Yisheng had done. So each of these model runs is simulated using, is parameterized using data from a real experiment. And by doing this and rerunning his experiments in the computer, Yisheng was able to show the same outcome for each of the competitive interactions between the wild and domesticated forms. So the model is able to reproduce the experimental result. And what a model can do that an experiment in the physical world can't do is it allows you to do experiments like this one, where Yisheng was able to switch the input trait values between wild and domesticated forms one at a time. And in doing that, he's able to establish which of these traits is responsible for the model outcome. So in this example I've shown here, he's switched leaf angles. So he's taken the domesticated leaf angle, put it into the wild, and taken the wild leaf angle and put it into the domesticated. And doing that, he switches the outcome of competition, which tells us that leaf angle plays an important role in establishing that competitive ability. And in doing that, he's able to scan through a series of traits and show that steeper leaf angles, larger leaves are really important across all the domestication events, and then greater main stem dominance. So these are taller plants with larger, more erect leaves that are becoming more stronger competitors. There are other traits that are important for some domestication events, but not others. So Alicia Gomez-Fernandez was interested in figuring out when this change in competitive ability occurred. And in her experiment, the design was slightly different. She had a focal plant without competition and then with competition from weeds. So in this case, 3 Lolium multiflorum weeds. And Alicia focused specifically on the Emma domestication event. So she has wild Emma, domesticated Emma landraces. And then you can't see because my face is sitting in front of the phylogeny here, but derived from those Emma landraces are the free threshing durum wheats. So landraces of wheat, durum wheats, and then improved varieties of durum wheat. So using this comparison, Alicia's able to say something about when this change in competition happened. And the upshot of this work is that there are significant interactions here in the effect of competition on the different groups. So if we look at relative growth rate here, the competition suppresses the growth rate of wild Emma, but the domesticated forms are able to maintain their growth rate under competition. And that leads to an interaction with biomass. So these domesticated forms, particularly the land races, have higher biomasses under competition than the wild form, although interestingly that effect is lost in, or partially lost in the improved varieties, the modern varieties, and I'll come back to that shortly. Here's the reason for that. In modern crops, we've selected against stronger competitive ability of individual plants. And that's because improved individual fitness in these kinds of row crops like wheat come at the expense of whole crop performance. So individual fitness in these plants, as I've shown you, is increased by plants having taller stature, more erect, larger leaves, and that captures light at the expense of neighbours. And to maximise the yield of the whole community, individual fitness needs to be reduced. And so modern breeding has done this by selecting for short plants with small leaves, and that benefits the whole group, at the expense of individuals. So I hope I've convinced you that competition has been a domestication mechanism that's responsible for some of the traits that we see in domesticated cereals, or wheat specifically. And our empirical evidence is consistent with a number of interpretations. So firstly, that the unintentional selection, the unintentional ecological process of competition caused selection during early cultivation. And that process was responsible for some traits of domesticated wheat that we recognise as part of a so-called domestication syndrome. So for example, large erect leaves, a thicker stem, the dominance of a central stem. And Alicia's work has shown us that those traits seem to have evolved during domestication, so before free threshing forms were derived from domesticated land races. And in modern breeding, we've reversed some of that strong competitive individuals to achieve high yields by the whole crop.